Hi, everyone. My name is Erin Tesh, and I'm Managing Director of TSG Consulting in North America. Also joining me is my colleague, Dr. Leslie Patton, who will, over the next 45 minutes, discuss inert ingredient petitions, including data requirements and what's included in a submission to EPA. I would encourage you to ask questions throughout the webinar in the Q&A box on the right of your screen, and we'll answer as many questions as the time allows. We have over 100 participants that have signed up for this webinar, and we're really delighted that you all could join us today. Before Leslie begins her presentation, for those of you unfamiliar with TSG, let me spend 1 minute providing you with a brief overview of TSG and our owner science group. TSG has been around for about 30 years. We provide regulatory and scientific expertise to our clients across various markets, including consumer, food and beverage, animal health, medical, agricultural, and industrial chemicals. We have regulatory and technical experts in many different disciplines, and we have offices throughout North America and Europe. Both Leslie and I are based in Washington, D.C. TSG is owned by Science Group. It's a UK-based, publicly traded company that supports clients with strategic and business initiative consulting, product development, and regulatory services. There's about 500 of us across the globe. We speak over 30 languages. We have 2 dedicated R&D facilities located in the UK. Moving on, EPA tells us that TSG has submitted more inert petitions than any other firm. We have felt very fortunate to have so many clients that have partnered with TSG to help them successfully obtain approval of their ingredient. In fact, we've submitted well over 70 petitions, and we've learned a few tricks along the way. The process has evolved over the years, and I'm delighted to introduce to you my colleague, Dr. Leslie Patton. Leslie has more than a decade of experience in regulatory toxicology. She specializes in food additives and food contact materials, pesticides, consumer products, and cosmetics. Leslie works closely with our regulatory experts to assist companies successfully register pesticide products as well as obtain inert ingredient approvals. Leslie has an undergraduate degree in natural resources from the University of Michigan and a PhD in environmental toxicology from Cornell University. With that, I'll turn the presentation over to Leslie.
Hi everyone, thanks Erin. I'd like to start off with a brief agenda of what I'll talk about today. I'll give you an overview of inert ingredients and their regulation in the CFR. We'll talk about some tools and databases that are available online on EPA's website. I will also talk about Priya, which is the Pesticide Registration Improvement Act that allows companies to register their pesticides and EPA to collect their money. Then I'll talk about submission content and particularly the data requirements needed for an inert petition. And then I'll end off with some of the pitfalls you may encounter when submitting these petitions. So what is an inert ingredient? Well, an inert ingredient is basically any component of the pesticide that does not contribute to its efficacy. The efficacy, of course, comes from the active ingredient. That is something that must be identified on the label of the pesticide. The inert ingredients do not have to be on the label, and they remain confidential. The inert ingredients help the formulation in other ways. There are things like emulsifiers, stabilizers, surfactants, fragrances, dyes, etc. Everything that is intentionally added to a pesticide must be approved by EPA. There is no concentration under which an approval is not necessary from the agency. There are 3 broad categories of inert petitions and inert approvals. The first is non-food contact pesticide inert. Then we have food contact pesticide inerts, and these chemicals require a tolerance or a tolerance exemption, and they may be limited. And then finally, fragrances that are to be used in non-food use pesticides have a special type of notification and also have some limitations that other ingredients do not have. So I'll start off talking about some of the food contact approvals in 40 CFR. These are listed in sections 189.10 through 189.60, and they apply to, they're split up into the inerts, the categories that the inerts are used for. So, for example, 189.10 contains the exemptions from tolerance or the tolerances for inert ingredients used in agricultural pesticides that are applied pre and post-harvest. The section 189.20 is for those applied pre-harvest only. Section 189.30 is for inert ingredients used in pesticides applied to animals. Section 189.40 includes tolerance exemptions and tolerances for active and inert ingredients that are used in antimicrobial formulations, otherwise known as surface sanitizing solutions. Section 189.50 lists tolerance exemptions for minimal risk actives and inerts, and I'll talk about this section a bit more in a minute. And finally, Section 189.60 are polymers that are exempt from tolerance that may be used in food or non-food use pesticide products. Section 189.40 lists active and inert ingredient tolerances and tolerance exemptions. The section is split up into 3 subsections, the first of which is, gives the broadest approval and includes pesticide ingredients that are used on surfaces in public eating places, dairy processing and equipment, and food processing equipment and utensils. And then the other sections of this, or the other subsections of this, are a little bit narrower in their applicability. 40 CFR section 189.50 includes pesticides, ingredients that are minimum risk, and these are exempt from federal regulations under 40 CFR section 152.25. These are things that are low risk, so for example, food commodities are listed, animal feed items, edible fats and oils, and then the final subsection of this contains miscellaneous specific substances that are minimum risk. So EPA on its website has made available some useful tools and databases that will help you in this process. The most important for inerts is called the Inert Finder. There's a screenshot here of what that site looks like. It's easy to use. You can search for a chemical by its name or CAS number, and once you put that in and push enter, the chemical pops up and it gives you information about the type of approval it has. So is it a food contact use, non-food contact? Is it on the fragrance list? If it's a food use pesticide ingredient, it will tell you what the use limitations are. For example, there may be a maximum percentage use in the formulation. In addition, some of the ingredients in food use pesticides are subject to data compensation, and that will be indicated in the Inert Finder entry. This is a great tool, and it works pretty well. Like many things in life, it's not perfect. Sometimes you can be looking for an inert ingredient that really is in there, but it won't come up. And sometimes that happens because inerts are listed as groups of chemicals. For example, alcohol, ethoxylates may all be listed together, but you may not be able to search for one specific one by name. Also, sometimes chemicals have more than one CAS number. So if you think something is in this list, or if it's important to you to know that it is or isn't there, you may try to look for it in a number of ways before accepting the answer that you get. A second database that EPA has on its website is the trade name database. This contains a list of inert ingredient mixtures that companies have made and submitted to EPA for this listing. It's voluntary. You do not need to submit your inert mixtures to EPA, but it does allow people to look for your product And as you can see in the screenshot here, it's listed by manufacturer as well. And then also it gives the type of approval it has. So those numbers there are the sections of 40 CFR that I referred to earlier, 189.10, 189.20, et cetera. And then also the last column there shows if it's for non-food use only. And what you do if you have an ingredient mixture that's named as a trade name, you submit the contents of it to EPA confidentially, and EPA will see the composition. They'll check and make sure everything in the composition is on the inert list already, and then they'll add it to this database, but the public will not have access to the composition. Finally, the fragrance ingredient list is another voluntary program that EPA has for inert ingredients and pesticides. This is a notification program for non-food use ingredients only. There are some limitations and requirements that were described by EPA in its fragrance notification program. For example, fragrances can only or each fragrance ingredient, most fragrance ingredients can only be up to 0.1% of a fragrance composition. The whole composition of the fragrance can only be 1% of the entire pesticide formulation. Fragrance houses can submit their fragrance composition to EPA, and the EPA once they've looked over the ingredients and made sure they're on this list, the fragrance can be used as a pesticide inert ingredient. This is a part of Inert Finder, so if you are a fragrance house making a fragrance and you want to know if your ingredient is already approved for use in pesticides, or if it's already on the FIL, you can look at it with, you can search for it with the Inert Finder. And then finally, on EPA's website, our IIAB, which is the Inert Ingredient Assessment Branch, that's part of EPA that does this work. They've published a bunch of guidance documents for help with inert petitions. The data requirements for inerts are not listed in CFR, unlike active ingredients. So these guidance documents are probably the best thing we have to understanding exactly what it is EPA requires for a successful submission. And so there's a bunch of documents. You know, one is for food use inert petitions, one for non-food use, there's one for polymers, and then there are a couple other types of documents that are helpful. There's one guidance document on how to submit to the trade name database that I mentioned. They also have one about good sites to search for toxicology literature that might go into your inert petition. So the next section, I will talk a little bit about Priya. Priya is the Pesticide Registration Improvement Act. This was the law that was established in 2014. It authorizes EPA to collect fees for reviewing pesticide applications, and this includes inert petitions. We are now up to the 4th iteration of Priya, creatively called Priya 4. This became just effective this year, and again, this is all available online, these tables, and for inert petitions, you want to look at Table 18. This contains all of the different categories for inerts, of which there are now 16. The different categories reflect whether your petition is for a food use, a non-food use, whether it's an amendment to an existing inert. It may be related, substantially similar to an existing inert. That's another Priya category. A polymer inert petitions is another Priya category. Priya 4 is a new category for safeners. And I guess a good thing about Priya 4, there's some good and bad. The good thing is that EPA learned a lot from some mistakes it made in Priya 3. The bad news is that this made the timelines longer. So basically, Priya dictates the cost and the review timeline that EPA has. The timelines in Priya 4 are generally longer because they weren't making the deadlines that they had set in Priya 3. So you can see here that it costs anywhere from about $1,600 to almost $600,000 for an inert petition. There's a 3 to 24 month review time, depending on the category, and there is a small business waiver that may be available of up to 75% for businesses under a certain size. Okay, so what goes into an inert ingredient submission? These are documents, again, they're all available on the EPA website. A transmittal document, there's a form on the website, Form 8570-1. For a food use inert petition, you need to submit what's called a notice of filing in Word version, which I'm going to talk about it more in a minute. You have to summarize your petition and then submit all the data that you reference in your petition. And you also, in addition, you have to submit the references themselves as separate data volumes. The notice of filing is something that EPA requires when you're setting a tolerance or an exemption from tolerance. So this would be for a food use inert petition. This is the text that EPA will publish in the Federal Register when the tolerance is granted. There are different versions of this form, the notice of filing. And when you're submitting an inert petition, you want to make sure you use the registration division's version. Even if your inert is to be used in an antimicrobial substance, registration division is where the inert branch is located. So use that form. The form looks like this. It's a colorful Word document. And you're meant to substitute all of the green text there with the data that you collected on your inert ingredient. And then you have to submit it to EPA in this format, in this colorful Word document format. Okay, this is definitely the most exciting part as a toxicologist because I like data. Maybe it may not be exciting to other people. What goes into, what's the data that go into an inert petition? Well, as I said before, there's nothing in the CFR that actually tells you what to put into an inert petition, but it's generally the same amount, the same type of information that's needed for an active ingredient. For inert petitions, you can leverage a lot, though, from the public literature and from modeling programs, toxicology, ecotox, environmental fate estimation programs. They're often accepted by EPA when data are not available, when new studies aren't available. The Inert branch accepts summaries of data perhaps more readily than they do when you're submitting a new active ingredient. And another great thing about the Inert branch is that they are receptive to making a pre-submission meeting, and they're easy to get a hold of. There's a convenient email address that I'm going to share with you later, and they're happy to talk to you about any kind of questions you have about data or just submissions in general. So there are quite a few data requirements. I mean, you look at it from the perspective of having the same sort of requirements as an active ingredient. A lot of types of toxicology data: acute toxicology, genotox, carcinogenicity, repeat dose toxicity, including reproductive and developmental endpoints, neurotoxicity, endocrine disruption effects, and immunotoxicity. Those are sort of the general categories. EPA also requires you to submit information about the metabolism of the inert ingredient in mammals. Information about ecotoxicity is included in the petition. Typically that's aquatic toxicity, but you may need to add terrestrial toxicity data as well, depending on your use. You should include a summary of the physical and chemical properties of the inert ingredient. This includes things like melting point, boiling point, partition coefficients, the sorption characteristics of the chemical to soil. And this ties in with this next bullet, the environmental fate. Your petition should characterize the environmental fate of the compound. For example, biodegradation data, water solubility data. Will this chemical move from surface water down into groundwater. Those are the types of things the EPA would like to know as a part of the Inert petition. Other less sciencey information that's required in the petition includes the Priya category. You should state what the Priya category is, the purpose in the formulation, is it an emulsifier, is it a dye? Also, you want to add what the current uses of the chemical are. So this includes other pesticide uses, but also things like, is it a food additive? Is it used in cosmetics? Is it used in drugs? Anything like that. That will help EPA characterize the overall exposure of the public to this compound. You also need to add something about the use limitation that you're proposing. And this is usually just the percent, the use level of the chemical in the pesticide. And sometimes you don't know that when you're submitting an inert petition. You're not at that stage yet. Or you aren't the pesticide manufacturer, so you don't know what that will be. But generally, you should have a general idea, and you should err on the side on the high side, because what EPA will do, what they may do with this number is make that number the limitation for a food use pesticide once they publish the tolerance in the Federal Register. They'll make the percentage that you suggest the limit. And so then if you decide later down the line to make a new product where you're using more of your inert ingredient, you'll have to do another inert petition to increase the limit. So, you need a balance, having sort of a high use limit with, you don't want to make it too high because then EPA may have a problem with the exposure. But that's just something to keep in mind. And then also in your petition, there's a lot of data listed here that's required. You're bound to not have all of it. And you should discuss, if certain types of data are missing, it's good to discuss why are they missing, why maybe it doesn't matter that they're missing, or address data requirements in other ways, which is something I'll discuss in a second. And then finally, you need to do some exposure quantification from the residential uses. So exposure to people in the residences, and also occupational exposure, and this is, pesticide, people applying the pesticide. And I will talk about this more later as well. So how are you going to satisfy all of these many data requirements? The most obvious answer is probably is an expensive answer. You can have the study run at a CRO and pay for it to be done, and that's of course a perfectly acceptable way to meet the data requirement, and the simplest way. But you don't necessarily have to do that. The first place really to look is in the scientific literature, because the work may already be done. You may be able to find a publication that has the type of tox data you need, or the chemical, environmental state data that you need already. So the public literature is a good place to go. Also, studies conducted by federal and state agencies are useful. The other thing you can use for an inert ingredient petition, often successfully, is you can look in documents, federal documents, such as ones from some EU documents, the European Food Safety Authority. They often summarize unpublished studies and publish those summaries. And they can be used, the summaries can be used to address data requirements in their petition sometimes. So that's definitely a place to look as well. There are also other ways, if there's no data at all out there, there are some other ways to meet data requirements. You can use, you can write rationales, or you can ask for a waiver from the requirement. And the first two bullets I've listed down here under rationales and waivers are documents that have been published by EPA, and they're pretty useful in talking about sort of alternate ways of dealing with meeting data requirements, and they'd be worth Googling. But basically, you can waive a data requirement if it's not really relevant to your chemical. So for example, if your inert ingredient is a gas, there's no reason to submit an oral tox study. So that would be good grounds for, requesting a waiver from that study. But you can also do things like look at structurally similar chemicals that do have data. In your inert petition, if you can make a good argument for two substances being structurally similar, and an argument that they, may be metabolized similarly by humans and animals, or if it's an environmental fate endpoint that they maybe, have a similar environmental fate in the environment, you make that argument, and then you can use data from that structurally similar chemical in your petition, and that will cover the data requirement for your inert ingredient. I mentioned some of the modeling programs before that EPA has published. You can meet some of the data requirements using those models. There are others, they don't have to be EPA models. There's some other good ones. There's one that's put out by OECD called the QSAR Toolbox. That assists you with making these structure-activity relationship comparisons. Then it also, once you find a structurally similar chemical, it will also tell you if there's data on that chemical. So that's another good tool. And then finally, if you have information about how your chemical is metabolized in the body, you can look at data, tox data on the metabolites instead of the parent chemical. So these are just some of the ways that we've addressed data requirements when the data aren't readily available. There are some additional data requirements for a food use inert petition. So this is for setting a tolerance or a tolerance exemption. You need to discuss the residue chemistry. So, and this can often be done qualitatively. You would provide information about maybe biodegradation, if it's a crop pesticide. You can provide information if it doesn't biodegrade. Use it, provide information about its toxicity. You just need to address what the residues will be. And then, of course, if it's a food use inert, you have to assess the dietary exposure and make an estimate of what the dietary exposure will be. And EPA does this, and we do this using some models. Again, the first one is an EPA model called IDEEM, which is the Inert Dietary Exposure Evaluation Model, and that is used for agricultural pesticide ingredients. And basically, it makes some assumptions, some very conservative assumptions about the inert ingredient and its use in pesticides, its use level. And you can play around a little bit with some of these assumptions and make it more relevant to your inert ingredient. But basically, the output is an exposure estimate, which is broken down by, by gender, by race, and some other ways in the U.S. population. The IDREAM model that stands for the Indirect Dietary Residential Exposure Assessment Model. This was one, it was made by the American Chemistry Council for estimating dietary exposure from components of sanitizing solutions that are used in the home. And again, it's a fairly conservative model, but it actually can be, if you have some information about your chemical, you can tailor it to that chemical and get a pretty good estimate of exposure. And then the last one I've listed here is an old FDA model for estimating exposure from sanitizing solutions that are used in industrial and commercial settings. And this one is a pretty, again, it's a pretty conservative model that makes a lot of assumptions that give you a high estimate of exposure, but still, may work well for you. And then there are some additional requirements made based on the Food Quality Protection Act of 1996, or the FQPA. This act required EPA to make a safety finding when setting tolerances with specific respect to infants and children. it allows the EPA to make a 1 to 10x safety factor on the tolerance that it determines. So in other words, if there's a chemical that EPA determines might be harmful to, say, development or the endocrine system, they may divide the tolerance level by 10 and make it a much more protective level. The SQPA also required EPA to consider aggregate risk, and this is something you have to consider in your inert petition. Aggregate risks are aggregate exposure considers pesticide exposure, but also, it considers the exposure from a number of sources, including the diet, water, and any other residential or non-occupational source, and to consider that aggregate risk when setting a tolerance for an inert chemical. And then finally, the SQPA required EPA to consider the cumulative exposure to pesticide ingredients that have common mechanisms of toxicity. So you need to put something in your inert petition about the existence of other chemicals that the public may be exposed to that have the same mechanism of toxicity as the inert ingredient that you are petitioning. Okay, so this is the last category I'm going to talk about for inert petitions, the low-risk polymers. You need the same information as a regular inert petition on the toxicity, but you also have to show EPA that the polymer qualifies as a low-risk polymer as defined in 40 CFR section 723-250. This section and this polymer exemption originally, it relates to TSG, not FIFRA. TSG is the Toxic Substances Control Act. But the agency uses this to define low-risk polymers, and basically you have to show EPA that this is a low-risk polymer by checking off some boxes about the polymer. And so you have to provide them data about the structure of the polymer, a diagram of it. Basically, you have to show them it doesn't contain certain atoms that aren't allowed under the low-risk polymer exemption. You have to provide the number average molecular weight of the polymer and the method that you use to determine that weight, which is usually the gel permeation chromatography, or GPC. You submit a representative chromatogram from GPC or whatever method you use. And then you provide EPA with the percentage of oligomers in that material that are below 1,000 daltons and below 500 daltons. And then finally, the last criterion is you need to provide biodegradation data, hopefully a study or maybe some modeling showing that the polymer does not biodegrade. Those are the low-risk criteria for polymers. So, some pitfalls that you may encounter along the way in your inert petition. One of the tough things about inert ingredient petitions is that there's no way to look up data submissions that have been done previously to EPA. If you're registering an active ingredient, you can use the NPERS database, which lists everything that's been provided to EPA from other registrations. This doesn't exist for inert, so you don't have a good way of knowing what data exists, what unpublished data exists out there. All of the literature you reference has to be provided to EPA in separate volumes. You can't just reference it. You have to give a copy to EPA. The only things you don't have to give to EPA are studies that have MRID numbers already, because that means the agency already has a copy of them. And also documents published by EPA, you can just reference. You don't need to provide them. Hopefully EPA has a copy of their own document. In the inert database, as I mentioned previously, food use inerts may have maximum use rates. Non-food use inerts do not have this in the inert database. However, some non-food inerts have a maximum use rate. So how are you supposed to know what that is? Well, it's not publicly available. So probably the best way to know if there is already a use limitation on an inert that's approved is to consult with the inerts branch. And then finally, make sure you address all the data requirements, even if there are no data available. As I mentioned previously, don't just skip things that you don't have information about. At the bottom here is the email for the Inert branch, which, as I mentioned, you know, on the spectrum of government agencies, response time, this one's good. They get back to you in pretty good time. So I advise you to, you know, go to them if you need to. Or, even better, come to TSG. We have, as Erin pointed out at the beginning of this talk, we've done many inert petitions of all different types. We have a team of toxicologists and chemists and regulatory experts. We all work together to put together petitions. We've developed a lot of these data requirement strategies. In the absence of data, we can still put together a good petition that addresses all of the required endpoints. And we have a lot of experience engaging with the Inert branch at EPA. And so I think that we can be a good resource for somebody doing an Inert petition. And then finally, just a couple of key takeaways from this talk. Make sure you map out your strategy in advance, collecting data and the use of your Inert, et cetera. It's always good to have a strategy in advance. Use the Inert Finder. Make sure the Inert you're doing, your petitioning for is not already approved. Make sure you use the correct Priya code based on your use, your intended use. And then finally, as I just reiterated, I'll reiterate, address all the data requirements specified in those EPA guidance documents. And for the food use inerts, make sure you've addressed the FEPA requirements as well. And then again, here's the EPA Inert branch email. Use that resource as well. And then I'll go back to this. Just one final thing. If you would like, actually, we're going to email you. This is a paper that we published, I think earlier this year, on Inert petition strategies, and we will be emailing you this paper along with a copy of the webinar. So, Erin, I'll hand things back over to you if you want to.
Great. Well, thank you, Leslie. That was really informative. I think it sounds like in order to be successful, you need to do lots of homework up front. Make sure you're completely organized, you have a strategy, and that you make sure that you thoroughly address all of the data requirements adequately in order to get the petition approved on time. We do have a number of questions, and so we have about 20 minutes so we can answer these questions. So I will just kick off. Do you know if NPEERS has considered adding inert data to their database?
Not to my knowledge. No, they don't have it now.
Great, thanks. Do you know if EPA has made any determination about biostimulants not regulated under FIFRA for use as an inert ingredient?
No, they have not.
Okay. Another question, for antimicrobial ingredients, how does EPA distinguish between food sites that need listing under 180.940, for example, residential kitchen areas, versus commercial food production areas?
Well, if you recall, there are several subsections of 180.940, and so the first thing is, depending on what type of service you're talking about, it may fall under one of those other, you know, there's an A, B, and a C. But if you're talking about food surfaces and industrial settings, that should be 180.940A. Unless it's I think the other sections are just one's for dairy equipment, and one's for food processing equipment, if I recall correctly.
Okay. Another question has to do with data compensation. We actually have two questions. First is the data compensable that's submitted to support an inert ingredient? So the data for food use inerts is, that data is compensable.
and the time period is similar. If you know about the time period for data composition for active ingredients, it's a similar situation. It's compensable for 15 years from the time it's submitted to EPA.
Okay.
Oh, and it's one thing. Sorry, one other thing.
Sure.
That information is available on Inert Finder. If there are chemicals on there that are subject to data compensation, that it will be listed as such on the Inert Finder.
So that was actually the next question is how do you ensure that the data compensation is listed for a petition? And it sounds like the Inert branch is put onto that list.
Right,
and
correct.
If you don't see it, you need to reach out to EPA?
Yes,
okay.
because the Inert Finder is not foolproof.
Okay. Another question has to do with low-risk polymers. The question is, do you have any insight into how much biodegradation in a study will be too much? For example, if you have a 15% biodegradation in a study, would the Inert branch think it's too much to meet the PLC criteria?
There is a level, and 15% sounds. I have to admit, I can't, off the top of my head, I can't remember what the level is, but there's a certain amount of biodegradation in 28 days, I think it is, that makes it count as readily biodegradable. And so if you're within that, then you don't qualify. But there can be a little bit of, I mean, it's not 100% or 0%. I'm sorry, I don't, off the top of my head, I cannot remember what the percentage is that makes it readily biodegradable versus not. But it should be available. If you look in the test guideline, it should be in there for a biodegradation study.
So this is related. So do you have any opinion about ECHA objections on microplastics and the need for polymers not to be biodegradable?
Sorry, so could you say it again?
The question is, any opinion about ECHA objections on microplastics and need for polymers not to biodegrade?
Well, I mean, I think there's a few different issues there. I mean, microplastics obviously haven't gotten a lot of bad press, and I don't know, they're not pesticides, so I'm not sure they really relate, how much they relate to the talk, but you know, I have personal opinions on that. I'm probably not supposed to get them here, but so that's why I'm kind of hemming and hawing. I would say there's a lot of microplastics in pesticides, so maybe it's just a discussion for another day.
Okay. What about if my ingredient is already approved under TSG or FDA? Does that make a difference?
No, it does not.
Okay.
Although, I mean, there's stuff, you know, you could add that to your petition. If it's a food additive, you know, this is certainly information that's good to put in your petition. It'll strengthen the weight of evidence that it's a safe, you know, a safe ingredient if it's in food, likely.
Mm-hmm. Okay, here's another one. My ingredient is approved for food use, but I submitted an application to EPA and the agency says I do not have the correct food use approval. What am I missing? Well, you're probably trying to petition it for a use that it's not already approved for. So you should look at, you know, for example, if it's an agricultural pesticide inert, it may only be approved for pre-harvest use. That's one of the sections of 180, it's 189.20, 40 CFR. So if you're trying to use it post-harvest, then you need an amended petition. Okay. Another question is, can my inert approval be exclusive to me, to my company?
No, it can't. It doesn't work that way. That would be nice sometimes, but it's in the public domain once it's approved.
Okay, another question is there any talk of a pathway to qualify new inert ingredients for minimum risk pesticides?
No, it's the same process as any other kind of inert.
Okay. Will EPA expedite review times for inert ingredients?
No, they will not. That's for sure. Look on that Priya table for your timeline.
Okay, another question, and thank you. We encourage you to ask questions. We're delighted you're asking questions. All right, I'm a fragrance producer. Do I need to submit my entire formulation to EPA for the addition to the fill?
Yes, you do. Yeah. You have to, every component of a fragrance has to be on the fill.
Okay, the next question is, my supplier tells me that all the inerts are approved by EPA, but EPA is asking for confirmation of approval. How do I handle this?
Well, I assume you're meaning you don't know what the inerts are, which sounds like maybe it's a trade name, like a proprietary mixture. So what you should do is get your supplier to put that on the trade name database, so they can submit their composition to EPA without having to tell you what it is.
Okay. Do chemicals and adjuvants need to be approved by under the inerts list?
Yes, if you're going to use them in a pesticide.
Okay.
Yes.
How does the timing work for when pesticides, if you submit an application for a pesticide product that contains the registration, that contains the inert rather, but then the inert is under review, how does that timing work within EPA?
The Inert Petition, they will review them simultaneously, but the Inert Petition has to be approved before EPA will approve the whole pesticide formulation. So in terms of timing, you're looking at, you're not going to, the timing on the Priya timing will be whatever the longer time frame is, which is probably the pesticide product. But the inert ingredient has to be reviewed first.
Okay.
And approved.
Okay.
First.
Does an inert petition need to be tied to a registration or registration action?
No, it does not. You can just submit an inert petition on its own.
Do you have any recommendations in terms of sort of limits for if you're submitting an inert petition that's not tied to a registration? Should you be going with the highest limit?
Oh, yeah. So as I mentioned in the talk, if you're petitioning for an inert and you don't quite know how it'll be used, or at what level it'll be used in a pesticide, you should err on the higher side. Otherwise, you'll have to amend the petition, which is a whole new pre-action. So you should probably think about the highest percentage at which it may be used and go with that.
Okay. Let's see. How do you handle if you go over the Priya date for a food inert petition? If EPA doesn't meet their deadline, I think that's the question.
Oh, well, that happened a lot with Priya 3, and they will send you an extension. That's called a request for an extension, but they're not requesting it. They're telling you that they're extending the Priya timeline. So hopefully now that all the Priya times are longer under Priya 4, that won't happen anymore, but we'll see.
So what's your experience, Leslie, with Priya substantially similar inerts? Have you had success in terms of seeking an approval of an inert that is substantially similar to another inert?
Yeah, definitely. If you look in the inert database, there's a lot of times there's things kind of grouped together. You can sometimes petition some very similar compounds together. Things like, I think the example I use before is alcohol ethoxylates of different chain lengths, say maybe 30 different chain lengths. But you can also add to, so if they already have one of those approvals, but you want to add one that's not included in the existing approval, that's an example of a substantially similar. And yes, we've done several of those.
Okay. Well, I think I've asked all the questions that we've received. If you have any further questions, please send them quickly.
Let me put my, there's my email. Anyone, please, feel free to contact me after this.
We're delighted that you all were able to join us. I hope you learned something. Leslie's contact's there. As we said, we will be sending out this presentation along with the paper to those that have, oh, we've got one more question, to those that are participating. With respect to data compensation, if a tolerance petition is submitted using waivers, justifications, but no new data, is any data compensable to recoup costs of the justification?
No. Only data that you pay for, you pay a lab to produce is compensable.
Okay, yeah, good. All right, well, thank you, everyone. We really appreciate it. We hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you.